There's something hauntingly beautiful about abandoned amusement parks. Once filled with laughter and bright lights, now they stand frozen in time-rusted rides creaking in the wind, ticket booths covered in dust, and forgotten prizes still hanging from their hooks, their colors faded to ghosts of what they once were. But it's not just the decay that makes these places unsettling, it's the echoes. Some say that laughter never truly leaves a place. That joy and fear seep into the metal and wood, staining the very ground where they once thrived. And when the lights go out and the crowds disappear, those echoes remain trapped between the cracks of rusted Ferris wheels and tangled vines. Urban explorers whisper stories of carnival music playing in the dead of night, of rides starting up on their own, of shadows moving just out of sight. Few dare to enter, but those who do rarely forget what they find. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey through 3 of the most infamous abandoned amusement parks. Places where time stands still, where joy has turned to sorrow, and where echoes of the past refuse to be silenced. First, we'll step inside the crumbling gates of Forgotten Funfair, a park where laughter still lingers in the air, even though no one's been there for decades. Then, we'll ride the rusted rails of the Screaming Serpent, a roller coaster that never truly stopped running. And finally, we'll wade through the flooded ruins of Aqua Haven, where the water is still and silent, except for the whispers. But be warned, sometimes echoes are more than just memories. Sometimes, they're waiting for someone to hear them. Are you ready to listen? They call it the Forgotten Funfair. Hidden away on the outskirts of a small, nameless town, it once thrived with the sound of laughter and the smell of cotton candy swirling through the air. Children raced from ride to ride, their faces lit up with joy, while parents watched from rusty benches, smiles stretched across their faces. But in the early 2000s, the gates closed for good. No warning, no announcement. The vibrant lights flickered out one last time, leaving the park to rot and rust under the weight of silence. No one seems to know exactly why it shut down. Some say financial trouble, others whisper about accidents, rides malfunctioning, children disappearing. And then, there are the stories that make even the boldest urban explorers think twice. Tales of shadows that move on their own, of distant carnival music playing long after midnight, of laughter echoing through empty grounds. For years, I brushed those stories off as small-town rumors, ghost tales to keep kids from sneaking into the park after dark. But that was before I decided to see it for myself. It was late October when I finally made the trip. A heavy fog clung to the ground, snaking through the rusted gates like ghostly fingers. The entrance sign still hung above, its paint chipped and faded, barely legible. "Welcome to the Forgotten Funfair!" The exclamation mark dangled by a single bolt, creaking in the wind. I climbed through a gap in the fence, my flashlight cutting through the mist as I stepped onto the cracked pavement. Everything was still too still. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, like the world itself is waiting for something to happen. The first thing I saw was the carousel. Once bright and full of life, it now stood frozen in time. Horses with chipped paint and glassy eyes stared straight ahead, their bodies tangled with vines. I walked closer, the wooden planks creaking beneath my feet. That's when I heard it. A whisper of music, barely audible, like a distant radio caught between stations. It drifted through the air, just loud enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up. I stopped, listening, heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be real. The power had been cut off years ago, but the music played on. I took a step back, eyes locked on the carousel. Its painted horses stared back at me, their frozen grins stretched wide, chipped and peeling from years of neglect. My flashlight beam flickered, and for just a second I could have sworn I saw one of the horses move just the slightest twitch of its head. I blinked, the breath catching in my throat. Just the fog, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. But the music, it was getting louder. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It floated through the mist, weaving between broken-down game stands and rusted rides, carrying with it a soft, distant laughter. I turned away from the carousel, forcing my feet to move forward. The pavement was cracked and uneven, weeds pushing up through the concrete like skeleton fingers. To my left, the old Ferris wheel loomed against the foggy sky, its cars swaying slightly in the breeze. I stopped walking. The cars were moving. Not all of them, just one. A red cart near the top creaked back and forth, like something had just climbed inside. I shone my flashlight up at it, squinting against the mist. Empty. Completely empty. The wind, I told myself. It's just the wind. But my legs felt heavy as I forced myself to keep going, each step echoing through the silence. The music was louder now, a cheerful carnival tune that seemed almost taunting. I followed it, weaving through toppled trash cans and shattered glass. My flashlight flickered again, sputtering before stabilizing. I stopped in front of the old Hall of Mirrors. The entrance was still intact, though the red and white paint had long since faded to a dull pink. The doorway gaped open, its curtain flapping lazily in the breeze. I stared at it for a long moment. The music seemed to be coming from inside. I stepped closer, shining my light through the doorway. The beam bounced off the first set of mirrors, stretching my reflection into a long, jagged shadow. I hesitated. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, to climb back through the fence and forget I'd ever come here. But I couldn't. I had to know. The music grew louder as I stepped inside. My footsteps echoed, bouncing off the mirrors and back at me. I glanced to my left and saw my own reflection distorted, stretched out like I was trapped in a funhouse. I took another step, and the air grew colder, sharp enough to make me shiver. That's when I saw it. Just ahead, past the first row of mirrors, a flicker of movement. I stopped, heart pounding in my chest, and aimed the flashlight straight ahead. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty hallways of endless reflections. I squinted, eyes searching the shadows, but there was nothing. And then, in the mirror directly across from me, someone stepped into view. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The figure stood perfectly still in the reflection a silhouette, tall and unmoving, its face hidden in shadow. My heart hammered against my ribs as I whipped around, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The hallway behind me was empty, just rows of cracked mirrors stretching back to the entrance. I swallowed hard, my breath coming out in shaky bursts, and turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, only now it was closer. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, the cold air sharp against my skin. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were glued to the glass. The figure wasn't moving, not in the real world anyway, but in the reflection, it stepped forward, one deliberate step at a time, its movements smooth and unnatural, like it was gliding over the ground. My flashlight flickered again, and the music got louder. The carousel song, tinny and warped, like an old record player spinning just a bit too slow. I swallowed the knot in my throat and took a shaky step backward, my eyes still locked on the mirror. I couldn't see a face, just darkness where its eyes should have been, shadows where a mouth might be. But I knew it was watching me. I could feel it. The figure stopped just a few feet from the glass, its head tilting slightly to one side. My reflection, pale and wide-eyed, stared back at me, but the silhouette, it raised its hand. I felt my blood run cold as its fingers, long and thin, almost skeletal, tapped gently against the other side of the mirror. One tap, two, three. The sound was muffled, like it was coming from far away. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight as I crashed into a rusted popcorn machine. The noise shattered the silence, and for a brief moment, the music stopped. The carousel song cut out mid-note, and the park fell silent. I held my breath, listening, waiting. The mirrors were empty. My reflection was the only thing staring back at me, now shaking, terrified, alone. I didn't wait for the music to start again. I spun on my heel and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the silence. The hall twisted and turned, stretching out longer than it should have, like the walls were shifting just to keep me inside. Finally, I burst out of the Hall of Mirrors. gasping for air as I stumbled back into the fog-drenched park. The Ferris wheel loomed overhead, creaking gently in the breeze, its lone red cart still swaying back and forth. But the music had returned. And this time, it wasn't coming from the carousel. It was coming from the Ferris wheel. The carousel music drifted through the mist, soft and distant, like a lullaby played for ghosts. My eyes locked onto the Ferris wheel. Its red cart swung gently back and forth, creaking with each pass. The music was coming from up there, I was sure of it. My breath fogged in the cold air as I approached, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. I didn't want to get closer, but something about the music pulled me in, like a thread winding tighter and tighter. I shone my flashlight up the iron beams. Rust flaked off in jagged patches, the metal twisted and scarred from years of neglect, but the red cart, it looked untouched, almost pristine. I stopped at the base of the wheel, staring up at the empty seats swaying gently above me. That's when I noticed it's something in the red cart. I squinted, lifting the flashlight higher. There was a figure sitting inside. I sucked in a breath, my heart hammering so loud I could barely hear the music anymore. The fog swirled thicker, coiling around the iron beams like living shadows. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I staggered back, almost slipping on the moss-covered concrete. No way, I whispered, shaking my head. But the cart kept swaying, back and forth, as if someone had just been there, rocking it with their weight. And then, with a groan that cut through the silence, the Ferris wheel began to move. Metal screamed against metal, rusted gears grinding as the wheel creaked to life. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a broken popcorn stand, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. I watched in horror as the wheel turned, slow and deliberate, dragging the red cart down towards the ground. I wanted to run. I should have run. But my feet were rooted in place, like the cracked pavement had wrapped around my ankles. The red cart descended, its metal frame groaning under the weight of decades. It stopped right in front of me, swaying gently, the music still whispering from somewhere unseen. The door creaked open. It swung outward, with a long, tortured groan revealing the shadowy interior. I took a step back, my flashlight beam shaking. Empty. Completely empty. But I knew I'd seen something. Someone. The music grew louder, a discordant whine that set my teeth on edge. My hands shook as I reached out, almost against my will, and gripped the edge of the cart door. The metal was cold, far colder than it should have been. I leaned forward, peering inside, half expecting something to lunge out at me, but there was nothing. Just a bench covered in dust and cobwebs, the smell of rust thick in the air. I was about to pull back when I saw it. Etched into the glass window of the cart thin, jagged scratches spelling out two words: "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the words, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Help me!" scratched from the inside. The laughter faded into the mist, but the echo of it lingered, like it was caught between the rusted metal beams. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to look back up at the Ferris wheel, but I couldn't stop myself. My flashlight beam cut through the fog, sweeping over the iron skeleton until it reached the top. There was no one there, just the empty carts, swaying in the breeze. I took a step back, my breath fogging the cold air. The message on the window "Help ME" was still there, scratched deep into the glass like it had been carved with something sharp. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I needed to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But as I took a step back, I heard it again. The music. It drifted through the park, slow and sweet, like a lullaby coming from deeper inside, past the Ferris wheel, past the rusted gates and broken down rides, into the shadows where the fog seemed to grow thicker. I didn't want to follow it, but my feet moved anyway, like I was being pulled forward. I passed what used to be the carnival games ring toss, balloon darts, all of them frozen in time. The stuffed animals were still hanging from their hooks, their fur matted and gray, eyes glassy and lifeless. A pile of faded tickets lay scattered across the pavement, fluttering slightly as I walked past. The music grew louder. I rounded the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. In front of me, shrouded in mist, stood the funhouse. Its paint was chipped and flaking, the colors faded almost to nothing. Above the entrance, a giant clown face grinned down, its eyes wide and unblinking. One of its pupils was missing. Just an empty black socket that seemed to stare right through me. The door was open. Not just unlocked, it was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges, and from inside, the music spilled out, soft and inviting. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to move. I took a step forward, and then another, until I was standing right in front of the entrance. The music stopped. Silence crashed over the park, heavy and suffocating. I swallowed, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond the doorway. The light stretched into the hallway, bouncing off cracked mirrors and dust-covered floors. The air smelled stale, like mildew and old popcorn. I took a breath, steeling myself, and stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing off the mirrored walls. I walked forward, each step careful, my flashlight flickering slightly as I moved deeper inside. I turned the first corner and nearly dropped the light. A mirror stood directly in front of me. Floor to ceiling, its surface fogged with dust and grime. But there was something wrong with my reflection. I stepped closer, wiping away the dust with my sleeve. My handprint smeared across the glass, but it wasn't my face looking back. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness, but the hallway behind me was empty. Just mirrors reflecting mirrors, stretching back to the entrance. I whipped back to the glass. The figure was still there. It stood just behind my reflection, almost blending into the shadows. I couldn't make out a face, just a tall, dark silhouette, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if watching me with quiet curiosity. My hands shook as I raised the flashlight, pointing it directly at the mirror. The beam bounced back, flooding the hallway with light. But in the reflection, the figure didn't move. I took a step back, my footsteps creaking against the rotting wood. The figure stepped forward. I froze. My reflection stayed perfectly still, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. But the shadow in the mirror, it moved again. Another step, slow and deliberate, until it stood right behind my reflected shoulder. I watched, paralyzed, as its hand reached up and rested gently on my reflection's shoulder. I couldn't breathe. I staggered back, my flashlight flickering wildly as I scrambled away from the mirror. I kept my eyes locked on the glass, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. The shadow in the mirror leaned forward, its head hovering inches from my reflection's ear. I watched, rooted in place, as its mouth moved. No sound came out, just the movement of its lips, slow and deliberate, whispering words I couldn't hear. That's when I realized it wasn't whispering to my reflection. It was whispering to me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a pile of broken boards. My flashlight beam swung wildly, catching glimpses of cracked glass and splintered wood. I tore my gaze away from the mirror and turned to run. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching out, winding in impossible directions. Mirrors lined the walls, catching my reflection as I passed. But every time I glanced back, that shadow was still there, just behind me, just out of reach. The music started up again, soft and distant, echoing through the funhouse. But this time, it was slower, warped, like the record was dragging, stretching out the notes into something unrecognizable. I rounded a corner, skidding to a stop in front of another wall of mirrors. My flashlight flickered and I heard Ida's soft whisper, so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. "Stay and play." I jerked around, shining the light back down the hallway. Empty. Completely empty. But the whisper lingered, repeating itself over and over, growing fainter each time. "Stay and play. Stay and play." I backed up until my shoulders hit the glass behind me. My own reflection stared back, eyes wide and terrified. I watched my chest heave with every breath, watched my hands shake as I held the flashlight. But something was wrong. My reflection blinked. I didn't. My mind went blank. I stared at the mirror, frozen, my breath coming out in ragged bursts. My reflection stood perfectly still, eyes unblinking, mouth slightly curled into a smile that I wasn't making. I staggered back, nearly slipping on the cracked wooden floor. The reflection didn't move. It stayed rooted to the spot, its eyes locked onto mine, the grin spreading wider, stretching far too wide for any human face. "Stay and play." The whisper came again, soft and sweet, echoing through the hall of mirrors. The music swelled louder, drowning out my own thoughts, and the lights above me flickered to life, one by one, casting long, crooked shadows across the floor. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I spun around and ran. The hallway stretched out before me, twisting and winding, mirrors lining every wall, reflecting thousands of versions of myself running, stumbling, eyes wide with terror. But in each one, just behind me, the shadow followed, its hand still resting on the shoulder of my reflection, its grin growing wider with each passing second. I reached the entrance, my hands slamming into the double doors. They didn't budge. I shoved harder, panic flaring in my chest. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, hundreds of voices murmuring in the shadows. Laughter echoed from deep inside the fun houses, oft and distant, like children playing just out of sight. I threw my weight against the doors again. They groaned and finally burst open, sending me sprawling onto the cracked pavement outside. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight skittering out of my hand and rolling into the fog. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, and glanced back. The funhouse stood silent, its doors slightly ajar, the painted clown grinning down at me with dead, glassy eyes. The music had stopped. The whispers faded into the mist. I didn't look back again. I ran past the Ferris wheel, past the carousel with its frozen horses tangled in vines, past the broken-down game booths and toppled ticket stands. I climbed back through the gap in the fence, my hands shaking so badly I nearly slipped on the slick grass. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My breath came out in ragged gasps, the silence almost deafening. I looked up at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something there. Nothing. Just my own pale, wide-eyed face staring back. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. As I pulled away, I cast one last glance in the mirror, back towards the rusting gates of forgotten funfair. The fog hung thick and heavy over the park, swallowing the rides, the broken-down stands, everything. But just before I turned the corner, I saw it. They called it the Screaming Serpent, towering above the tree line like the skeleton of some long-forgotten beast. The roller coaster stood frozen in time, its tracks twisted and rusted, stretching into the foggy sky. It was the crown jewel of the old amusement park haunts, the fastest, tallest ride for miles. People came from all over just to feel the drop in their stomachs as the coaster screamed around its loops. But now, it was nothing more than a rotting monument to tragedy. The accident happened in the summer of 1995. A hot July afternoon, the kind where the pavement shimmered with heat and the smell of funnel cakes clung to the air. The coaster had been packed, as usual, kids laughing, parents holding onto their hats as the cars rattled up the first massive incline. But something went wrong. The official report called it a mechanical failure, but those who were there remembered more than just broken bolts and faulty brakes. Witnesses said the coaster stopped dead at the top of the first drop, hanging there for nearly 15 minutes before it finally lurched forward. Screams echoed across the park, louder than usual, sharper, more desperate. When it finally came to a stop, 2 of the rear cars were empty. Completely empty. Restraints locked, seatbelts still buckled, but the riders, gone. The park shut down the ride that same evening. They boarded it up, chained the gates, slapped on warning signs. Within a few years, the entire park followed, falling into disrepair and fading from memory. But the Screaming Serpent remained, towering over the crumbling ruins like a rusted serpent waiting to strike. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. They said if you climbed the fence after midnight, you could still hear it, the creak of the coaster inching up the tracks, the faint whisper of wheels cutting through the silence. Some even claimed they'd seen the cars moving, gliding along the rails with no one inside. I didn't believe it, not at first. But that was before I saw it for myself. It was late October, just after midnight. The fog hung low over the ground, thick and swirling, clinging to the grass and snaking through the broken turnstiles. I squeezed through a gap in the fence, my breath fogging the cold air. The park stretched out before me, dark and silent, broken rides looming like skeletons in the mist. The coaster towered above everything else, its tracks winding through the fog like veins of rusted iron. I shone my flashlight up the first hill, the beam barely reaching the top. The air was still too still, like the whole park was holding its breath. I walked forward, each step echoing against the cracked pavement. The entrance to the Screaming Serpent was still standing, though the turnstiles were choked with vines and rusted in place. The sign above the gate hung at an angle, the paint faded and peeling. Screaming Serpent, the ride of your life. The clicking grew louder with each step I took, echoing off the twisted metal and broken concrete. My flashlight beam flickered as I walked along the platform, passing row after row of empty seats. The coaster looked untouched, like it was just waiting for someone to climb in and pull the lap bar down. But the dust and rust told a different story. It had been years since anyone had ridden the Screaming Serpent. I leaned over the edge, shining my light down the first drop. The tracks vanished into the mist, stretching down into the fog-covered valley below. I listened, heart pounding in my ears. The clicking noise continued, steady and deliberate. It was coming from somewhere, out there, hidden in the fog. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to get the hell out of there before whatever was making that noise came any closer. But something pulled me forward. Curiosity? Stupidity? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I climbed over the safety gate, my shoes scraping against rusted metal as I stepped onto the tracks. They groaned under my weight, the sound stretching out into the stillness. I took a shaky breath and began walking, the flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me. The fog grew thicker as I moved forward, swirling around my legs, clinging to the metal rails. The sound of my footsteps was muffled, almost swallowed up by the mist. But the clicking, it grew louder, sharper. Click, click, click. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not random at all. My mind raced through explanations: an old generator? Some broken mechanism still struggling to work after all these years? But it didn't make sense. The park had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. I kept moving, the tracks stretching ahead of me like a path into the unknown. I passed the first big loop, its metal frame towering above me, vines curling around the supports like skeletal hands. The fog hung thick in the air, heavy with the smell of rust and damp earth. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet ahead, the fog thinned just enough for me to make it out a single roller coaster car, perched on the rails. It sat perfectly still, facing down the track, its metal sides gleaming dully in the light of my flashlight. I hesitated, my breath fogging the air. I hadn't seen it when I climbed onto the platform. I was sure of it, but there it was, perfectly positioned, like it had been waiting for me. I stepped closer, my shoes scraping against the tracks. The fog curled around the car, swirling and shifting as I approached. I leaned in, peering through the dust-covered window. Empty, just rows of faded red seats, vines snaking through the cracks, leaves piled in the corners. My heart pounded in my chest as I circled around to the front. That's when I saw the message. It was scratched into the metal hood of the car, the letters jagged and uneven, like they'd been carved with something sharp. Get in. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight as the car shuddered again, its wheels grinding against the rusted tracks. My mind screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, eyes locked on that single word scratched into the hood. Get in. Click, click, click. The noise grew louder, rhythmic, and steady, like the heartbeat of the park itself. The car creaked forward another inch, then stopped, its headlights flickering for just a split second before going dark again. I swallowed hard, my breath clouding the air in jagged bursts. This wasn't possible. The park had been abandoned for almost 2 decades. No power, no maintenance, nothing. But the rails beneath my feet hummed with life, the vibrations traveling up my legs, pulsing with every click. The fog thickened, curling around my ankles like it wanted to drag me forward. My flashlight flickered, and for just a moment, I thought I saw movement shadowy figures drifting along the tracks, just beyond the edge of the light. I blinked, and they were gone. I turned back to the car. It sat there, still and silent, but now the lap bar was raised, inviting. The fog around it shifted and swirled, parting just enough to make it seem like the only clear path forward. I took a step back, shaking my head. No way. No damn way, I whispered, voice trembling. But the fog pressed closer, swirling around my legs, blocking out everything behind me. It was like the whole world had disappeared, leaving only the tracks and the waiting car. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was hypnotized. Maybe the whispers were getting louder, I still don't know. But my feet moved forward, crunching over broken glass and rusted bolts, one step at a time. The air grew colder as I approached, each breath fogging out in front of me. My hand shook as I reached out, gripping the edge of the car. The metal was ice cold, slick with condensation. I leaned in, shining my flashlight over the seats. Dust and grime coated the vinyl, vines snaking through the cracks. I climbed in. The seat groaned under my weight, dust puffing up around me. I hesitated for a moment, fingers hovering over the lap bar. I almost pulled back. Almost, but the fog pressed closer, curling around the car, blotting out the tracks behind me. I swallowed hard and pulled the bar down. It locked into place with a metallic snap. The fog seemed to thicken, coiling tighter, muffling all sound. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. For a second, all I could hear was my own breathing, harsh and ragged. Then the clicking returned. Click, click, click. It was louder now, vibrating through the car, rattling the metal beneath me. I gripped the lap bar, my knuckles white. The car shuddered, lurching forward another inch, then another. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering in my chest. And then, with a sudden jolt, the car surged forward. The whisper sent ice down my spine. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing, just the fog swirling thick and heavy behind the car. My breath came out in ragged bursts, fogging the air as the coaster creaked higher and higher up the incline. The clicking grew louder, echoing up the iron supports like a heartbeat. I tried to push up the lap bar again, my hands shaking, but it wouldn't budge. My flashlight had slipped from my grip when the car started moving, and now I was plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from pale moonlight filtering through the fog. The ascent seemed to go on forever. I knew the layout of the Screaming Serpent from old photos and park maps. It was supposed to be a quick climb, barely 30 seconds before the first drop. But this was different. The rails stretched into the mist, disappearing into shadows that seemed to go on for miles. My hands gripped the cold metal of the lap bar, knuckles white, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't hear anything but the clicking of the chain pulling me higher, the creak of metal under strain, and my own shallow breathing. Then the car slowed, shuddering slightly as it reached the peak. I leaned forward, peering over the edge. Below me, the fog stretched out like an ocean, endless and impenetrable. I couldn't even see the tracks anymore, just a swirling sea of gray stretching into oblivion. The car paused for a heartbeat, balancing at the very edge. The air went still. I held my breath. And then, with a violent lurch, it plunged forward. The tracks dropped away beneath me, and my stomach shot into my throat. Wind screamed past my ears as the car barreled down the incline faster than anything I'd ever experienced. My eyes watered from the speed, blurring the world into streaks of gray and black. The fog whipped past, tearing at my skin like icy claws. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the rushing wind. The rails groaned and shuddered beneath me, the car rattling as it shot through the first loop. My head snapped back, and for a split second, I was upside down, staring at the fog-covered ground far below. That's when I saw them. Figures in the mist-shadowy, faceless, lining the tracks as the car roared past. They stood perfectly still, their heads turning to watch me as I flew by. I blinked, my vision blurring from the speed. But they didn't disappear. They just stared. The coaster shot out of the loop, slamming back onto the straightaway, the force jerking me forward. My hands were numb from gripping the lap bar, my breath coming out in ragged bursts. I twisted in my seat, craning my neck to look back. There was nothing there, just swirling fog and empty tracks stretching back into darkness. But I knew what I'd seen. I faced forward just as the coaster began to climb again, the clicking resuming its steady rhythm. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, my mind raced, scrambling for some kind of explanation, but nothing made sense. The clicking grew louder as the car climbed higher, pulling me back up into the fog-covered sky. My hands ached from gripping the lap bar, but I couldn't let go. The metal felt freezing against my palms, almost like it was pulsing beneath my fingers. I swallowed hard, staring straight ahead as the rails stretched into the mist, disappearing around a sharp curve. The wind whistled through the cracks in the car, carrying with it the faintest hint of something rotten like wet leaves and rusted metal. We reached the top, the coaster shuddering as it slowed to a crawl. I sucked in a breath, bracing for the next drop. But instead of plummeting forward, the car stopped. I froze. The clicking had stopped too. Silence crashed down around me, heavy and suffocating. I looked around, squinting through the fog. I couldn't see the ground, just endless mist stretching in every direction. The tracks ahead disappeared into darkness, the rails creaking slightly as the wind howled through the metal beams. I reached down, hands shaking, and tried the lap bar again. It didn't budge. My heart pounded harder. I was stuck suspended at the top of the Screaming Serpent, with nothing but fog and rusted iron around me. A whisper cut through the silence. "Do you see them?" I jerked my head up, heart slamming against my ribs. My breath clouded the air as I twisted in my seat, eyes scanning the fog. "Hello!" I shouted, my voice echoing back at me. Nothing, just silence. I turned back, gripping the lap bar until my knuckles ached. My breath fogged out in ragged bursts. I stared straight ahead, waiting for the car to lurch forward. But it didn't move. The fog shifted, parting just enough for me to see the tracks ahead. My blood ran cold. Figures stood on the rails, just beyond the mist shadowy, and still, their outlines flickering like candlelight. There had to be dozens of them, stretching along the tracks, unmoving, watching. I blinked, shaking my head. No, this isn't real," I whispered, my voice cracking. But they were still there, silhouettes blending into the fog, heads tilted slightly in my direction. And then, all at once, they took a step forward. My heart nearly stopped. I yanked at the lap bar, shoving against it with all my strength, but it wouldn't move. I slammed my hands against the metal, panic clawing up my throat. "Let me out! Let me out!" The figures kept moving, drifting closer, silent and smooth, gliding along the tracks like they belonged there. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands trembling. The coaster lurched forward. My eyes snapped open as the car shot down the track, the wind screaming past me. I looked back just once, just long enough to see the figures watching as I was pulled away, their shadowy forms fading back into the mist. And then, just before I rounded the corner, I saw one of them raise its hand and wave. The car rocketed down the tracks, metal shrieking and groaning beneath me. My hands were locked around the lap bar, knuckles white and trembling. The fog rushed past, whipping at my face, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The tracks twisted sharply, and the car followed, slamming me into the side of the seat. I gritted my teeth, blinking against the icy wind. The fog parted for just a second, revealing the looping structure of the coaster stretching into the sky, tangled with vines and rusted metal. I had no idea how long I'd been on this ride. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like hours. The car roared through another loop, flipping me upside down. My stomach dropped, and I squeezed my eyes shut, the blood rushing to my head. When I opened them again, I nearly screamed. We were climbing. The clicking had returned, louder and more insistent, rattling through the metal frame. I glanced over the side of the car and saw nothing but swirling mist below. No ground, no supports, just fog stretching endlessly beneath me. The car slowed as it reached the top, leveling out on a straight section of track. I exhaled shakily, blinking against the wind. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline flooding my veins. I tried the lap bar again, shoving at it with all my strength. It didn't move. That's when I heard it. Laughter. It started soft, just a whisper of sound drifting through the fog. Childlike. Innocent. It floated on the wind, curling around the metal beams, growing louder with each second. I twisted in my seat, eyes darting through the fog, but I saw nothing. The laughter grew louder, overlapping with other voices, dozens of them. Children laughing, giggling, playing just out of sight. I pressed my hands over my ears, my breathing growing ragged. "Stop! Just stop!" I shouted into the mist. The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, pressing in from all sides, echoing through the fog like it was bouncing off invisible walls. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it only made it worse. I could almost see them children running alongside the tracks, reaching out with pale hands, faces twisted into joyless grins. The car shuddered beneath me. My eyes snapped open, and I looked down at the lap bar. I froze. Tiny handprints were pressed into the dust-covered metal. I stared, breath caught in my throat. They weren't there before, I was sure of it, but now, dozens of them stretched across the metal, some overlapping, some smeared, like little hands had been pressing down, reaching, grasping. The car jolted forward. My hands flew back to the lap bar as the coaster began its descent again, rushing down the tracks with impossible speed. The fog tore past me, whipping at my face, blurring the world into streaks of gray and black. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The laughter grew louder, pressing against my skull, drowning out everything else. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the lap bar like it was the only real thing left. The lap bar hissed and unlocked with a sharp click, snapping me back to reality. My hands hovered above it, trembling, fingers numb from gripping so tightly. I glanced around, heart pounding, breath fogging in the icy air. The car sat motionless at the very peak of the Screaming Serpent, tracks stretching out into the mist, looping and winding through shadows I couldn't see. Below, the park lay frozen in time-broken rides and shattered game booths swallowed by creeping vines and fog. But it was the figures that held my attention. They stood perfectly still along the rails, lining the tracks like silent sentinels. The fog clung to them, masking their features, but I could make out their shapes all, thin, unmoving. My mouth went dry. There were dozens of them, stretching back as far as I could see, and all of them were watching me. I swallowed hard, my breath shaking. My instincts screamed at me to get out, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, locked in their gaze. One of them stepped forward. My heart stopped. I watched as the shadowy figure moved closer, smooth and deliberate, gliding along the tracks. It stopped just at the edge of the fog, head tilted slightly. I couldn't see its face, just darkness where its eyes should have been. A whisper floated through the air, soft and distant. "It's your turn." I shook my head, backing up against the seat. "No, I'm getting out of here," I stammered, forcing my hands to push up against the lap bar. It lifted easily now, the weightless metal groaning as it swung open. I scrambled out of the car, nearly tripping over the edge of the tracks. My shoes scraped against the metal, the fog swirling around my ankles. I looked back at the car, half expecting it to lurch forward again, but it sat silent and still. The whisper returned, louder this time. "It's your turn." I turned back to the shadowy figures. They hadn't moved except for the one that had stepped forward. It stood at the edge of the tracks, head tilted, hand outstretched, beckoning. My blood ran cold. I shook my head again, backing up further. "No, I'm not playing your game," I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure tilted its head farther, almost like it was curious. And then, from deep within the fog, the laughter started again. Soft at first, almost gentle, but then it grew, layering over itself, filling the air with giggles and shouts, voices echoing off the metal tracks. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran. The tracks stretched out before me, impossibly long, looping through the fog. My shoes slammed against the metal, echoing out into the silence. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The laughter followed me, bouncing off the rails, filling my head until I thought I might go mad. I rounded a corner, nearly slipping as the track dipped and curved. My legs burned, my lungs heaved. But I didn't stop. I just kept running, sprinting over the rails, the laughter nipping at my heels. My breath came in ragged bursts, the cold air burning my lungs as I staggered back onto the platform. The wooden boards creaked under my weight, dust swirling up from between the cracks. I turned to face the tracks, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The fog hung heavy and still, wrapping around the rails like skeletal hands. The shadowy figures stood perfectly still, their hands still raised in that unsettling wave. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. But they didn't disappear. They only stared back, unmoving, waiting. I took a shaky step back, nearly tripping over a rusted ticket booth. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. I couldn't take my eyes off them, those shadows that seemed stitched to the fog, lingering just out of reach. Then, slowly, the fog began to recede. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the way the mist pulled back, unraveling from the tracks like smoke drawn into invisible lungs. But it kept going, peeling back layer by layer, revealing the coaster's twisted metal frame. And then, I saw them. The rails were packed with people dozens, maybe hundreds standing shoulder to shoulder along the tracks. They were motionless, their faces turned toward me, eyes dark and hollow. Their clothes were tattered and faded, colors washed out like old photographs left too long in the sun. My heart stopped. I recognized some of them. Their faces. I'd seen them before, in the old newspaper clippings, in the stories people told about the accident, the missing passengers, the ones that never made it off, the screaming serpent. They stood silently, unmoving, their eyes locked onto mine. I staggered back, my hands shaking. "No, this isn't real," I whispered, my voice cracking. But the fog kept peeling back, revealing more and more faces, stretching along the rails, disappearing into the mist. And then, from somewhere deep in the fog, the clicking began again. Click, click, click. The figures stepped forward in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the damp boards. My eyes darted around the platform, searching for any way out, but the fog had coiled around everything, there was nowhere to go. The clicking grew louder, sharper, echoing off the coaster's metal frame. The figures stepped forward again, their hollow eyes never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, backing up against the railing. That's when I heard the whisper. Soft and distant, barely more than a breath. "One more ride." I turned, heart slamming against my ribs. The car I had just escaped from now sat at the edge of the platform, perfectly still. The lap bar was open, waiting. I shook my head, stumbling back. "No! I'm done! I'm done!" I shouted into the fog, but the whispers grew louder, layering over each other, dozens of voices whispering in perfect unison. "One more ride. One more ride. One more ride. One more ride." The car lurched forward with a violent jolt, slamming me back into the seat. My hands gripped the lap bar so tightly my knuckles turned white. The clicking grew louder, sharper, echoing through the fog as the coaster picked up speed. I couldn't move. My legs felt locked in place, my hands frozen to the bar as if they'd been welded there. The tracks stretched out ahead, disappearing into the thick mist, rails twisting and looping into impossible shapes. My heart hammered in my chest as the coaster climbed higher and higher, each click resonating like a drumbeat. The fog peeled back just enough for me to see. Below, the park stretched out in broken silence. But it wasn't empty. Figures stood along every ride, every pathway motionless and silent, their faces turned up toward me as I climbed. Hundreds of them, maybe more, pale and hollow-eyed, watching with expressions that hovered between curiosity and hunger. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look, but the whispers crept in anyway, faint and distant, like they were being carried on the wind. One more ride. One more ride. The car reached the top of the first incline and stopped. I sucked in a shaky breath, my eyes snapping open. I was at the very peak, suspended over the entire park. For a moment, everything went still. And then I felt Ida hand on my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But my body moved on its own, head turning inch by inch until I was staring over my shoulder. She was sitting right behind me. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that hung limp over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her skin pale as fog. She stared right at me, mouth slightly open, her hands gripping the edges of the seat. My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, locked in her gaze. Her mouth moved, lips cracking apart as she whispered, "It's almost over." The car dropped. I screamed, the wind ripping the sound from my throat as the coaster plunged down the track. The rails rattled and groaned beneath me, the car shaking so violently I thought it might shatter. My vision blurred, mist whipping past me, the ground rushing up to meet us. The loops came next, 3 of them, one after another. My body was slammed back and forth, my head snapping with each turn. I couldn't see, I couldn't breathe. Everything was a blur of fog and rusted iron. The laughter returned, louder than ever, echoing through the rails, bouncing off the metal, surrounding me from every side. Children's voices, giggling, shouting, cheering. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, but it only grew louder. And then, silence. The car screeched to a halt. My eyes flew open. I was back at the platform, but it wasn't rusted and broken anymore. It was shining, new bright lights flashing, carnival music playing in the distance. Conclusion. As we leave behind the rusted gates and tangled vines of these forgotten parks, the echoes of their stories linger, soft whispers carried on the wind, the distant creak of metal, the faintest hint of laughter in the dark. Forgotten Fun Fair, where the carousel still spins in the dead of night, shadows flickering between mirrors, and distant giggles follow your every step. The Screaming Serpent, where the ride never ends, and the lost riders still reach out from the fog, waiting for one more turn. And finally, Aqua Haven, where the water is never quite still, and the splashes of invisible swimmers ripple through the silent pools. These parks are more than just abandoned places. They are tombs of memory strapped between joy and tragedy, frozen in time but never truly at rest. Some say it's the weight of sorrow that keeps them alive, that echoes of laughter and screams leave scars, etched into metal and stone, refusing to fade away. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe the stories are still unfolding, waiting for the next visitor to step past the broken gates, to walk the cracked pavement, to hear the whispers and follow the music. If you ever find yourself wandering the outskirts of a forgotten town, and you stumble across rusted gates and carnival signs faded by time, maybe you'll hear it too. A distant song, a creaking wheel, a whisper, soft and inviting, one more ride. Because some parks never really close, they just wait.